So thank you everyone for attending today, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm going to focus in today's brief presentation on aspects of well-being and flexibility, and thinking about how we can place them at the center of the future of work. I included in the first slide a picture of my dog wearing my shirt. That was on the last day I was in work on March the 18th last year, which is an interesting case study in itself, I think, on the changes we've all faced in the last kind of 10-11 months in our working lives. So what I wanted to speak about a little bit today is to focus initially on thinking about well-being at work, and thinking about what existing debates have done to highlight this as a relevant and an important focus of the future of work. Then think a little bit about what specifically the last year has presented in terms of both challenges, but also in terms of insights into what the future of work can look like. I'm going to draw them back on research I've done using Understanding Society, in 3 different pieces of research that I've had published that's used the Understanding Society data to explore different aspects of flexibility and in particular well-being and its relationship together, and then draw to an end thinking about what we might think, what we can draw from that work in terms of insights into what the future of work might look like. So to start off with then, I mean, thinking about well-being at work and the existing debates around it. I mean, well-being at work's gained real significance, I think, in both the kind of policy environment, but also in terms of practitioners, in terms of academic research in the last kind of decade or so. That's not to say it wasn't central to a lot of people's work before that, but I think it's the strength of evidence and the strength of how much it's been highlighted in various different arenas. So I've highlighted here a couple of reports: the Good Work Taylor Review that is published in 2017, and also that year the Thriving at Work Stevenson Farmer Review, just as a couple of examples of reports that have been commissioned by the UK government that look at aspects of well-being at work. Now, there's different bodies of literature that look at this topic. So there's the good work literature, there's the job quality literature that's very closely related. But then there's also the more well-being focused literature as well that forms part of this debate. In recent years, organisations, for example, the CIPD, have started reporting on the quality of working lives. So I was fortunate to be involved in the writing of the 2019 survey report from the UK Working Lives Survey that they produce each year. And again, that's highlighting the relevance that this is given now, understanding the quality of work that individuals encounter throughout their working lives, and how that's changing as well, and how that differs among different groups. So that's a bit of context. So obviously the last year has presented a lot of differences. So the last year has presented some really interesting, presented some really interesting changes. And obviously, we have to use the word interesting carefully. We've been part of a global pandemic, but there's been a lot of changes to everyone's working lives in one form or another. And obviously a lot of the debate has been around the rapid expansion of remote working in one form or another. But that's not to say that's what everyone's experienced. And I think one of the things we have to acknowledge at the outset is that people have shifted to home working. Perhaps up to 40% or so of workers at peak were engaging in working at home. But that still leaves a substantial portion of the labour market, as we've seen in the previous presentation, either furloughed or out of work, or indeed continuing to work at a workplace. This change in working routines is an interesting thing to explore, because obviously there's an evidence base around different forms of flexible working, and I'm going to draw on that in thinking about my past research and how that can help with current debates around what the future of work might look like. These changes could act as a significant stressor. There could be well-being implications that are arising from them, and certainly some of the research that's been conducted has suggested that, some of the research in the last year. But of course, we're living in uncertain times, and that in itself presents a number of well-being challenges, and we have to kind of separate out those different drivers. A lot of the changes that have been witnessed have also, in principle, being temporary. The expansion of remote working, people having to negotiate work alongside childcare, where schools have been shut on more than one occasion in the last year in the UK. And obviously this has been consistent in other countries as well. But it's prompted a significant discussion and debate around permanent change in the way work is structured. Big expansion of remote working, changes to the nature of work. And indeed, I mean, I was speaking with someone last week, and just in terms of reflecting on the previous presentation, who suggested that in their organization, the whole discussion around hours of work and 4-day, 5-day weeks is gone. And it's all now instead focused around task-based employment, completion of tasks, and a much more flexible understanding of what it means to engage in paid work. So it's an interesting discussion, certainly in terms of how things are moving forward. So to try and inform some of this discussion, I thought I'd draw on 3 pieces of work that I've had published that have made use of the Understanding Society data. So the first one was published in 2017 and uses a combination of data from the British Household Panel Survey, so the kind of precursor to some degree of Understanding Society, although it had a slightly narrower focus and sample, and then the Understanding Society data, which actually in this paper only used the first couple of years of Understanding Society. So in this piece of work, that the focus was on understanding the well-being implications using measures of subjective well-being of the adoption of flexible working arrangements. So I undertook an initial kind of descriptive exercise, but then did some more advanced analysis that looks at changes in reported well-being over time and relative to changes in working patterns. So people who adopt a flexible working arrangement, whether that be part-time work, flexi-time, job share, or indeed home working. So a couple of the key things that came out of this research. The first was that just using the descriptive analysis, really interesting finding was the gap between availability and use of flexible working arrangements at this time. So this period covers, right from the 90s to the kind of 2010-11 period. And what was evident was that while a lot of organizations are starting to offer a number of different flexible working arrangements, there's quite small amounts of individuals actually making use of certain ones. And that was including home working, interestingly, given recent context. So the other key thing that came out of this piece of research was that it was evident very much that there was significant well-being benefits to be had from certain types of flexibility. And the flexibility in particular was flexibility that provided people over a level of control over either the timing or location of work. So flexi time and home working were found to have particular well-being benefits. In contrast, arrangements that were focused on reduction in hours were more often found to have negative impacts on individuals. So part-time, job share. Now, some of that, of course, is explained by other factors that influence in people's lives that usually drive them to work part-time, but the general broad finding was there. The second piece of research then. So the first piece, it's evidencing some lack of take-up of flexible working for one reason or another. And it's also, though, highlighting well-being benefits. The second piece of work I wanted to draw on briefly was one that focused more specifically on an intrinsic dimension of job quality, which is autonomy and control in work. So a well-documented important element of job quality, but also more broadly in most models of well-being, autonomy and control are identified as important aspects of our lives as drivers of well-being. So this second piece of work used data from 2 different waves of Understanding Society, wave 2 and 4, and it explored the links between forms of autonomy at work, which comprised the nature of the task, the order of the task completion, the manner of task completion, the pace of work and working hours. So autonomy over all those different factors, and looked at different well-being measures and the relationship between the two. What the research showed is that, as we would expect, higher levels of autonomy were positively associated with both job and leisure satisfaction. And they were positively associated with life satisfaction, but that came through in a much weaker result. Nevertheless, it was positive. So very clearly, the findings identified the well-being benefits of autonomy among employees, autonomy at work. But what was interesting as a kind of side to that is it also highlighted the distinct levels of autonomy that are present in people's jobs, and the fact that autonomy much more so remains present in highly skilled occupations, managerial and professional occupations. And then the third piece of work, which is a very recent piece of work that's just gone early view for urban studies, is a broader piece that looks at it combines, I guess, the previous two pieces together to some degree. It looks at aspects of job quality, but using a number of different measures of job quality, not just autonomy. And it combines that understanding with different workplace locations to explore kind of spatial flexibility around work, and the well-being impacts that has, and the job quality implications it has. So this piece of work again used Understanding Society waves. It used 4 waves in this case: wave 2, 4, 6, and 8, and it compares a number of job quality indicators. And the paper gives detail on that. I won't give detail on that now in the interest of time. And compares urban-based workers in standard working environments. And of course, this was pre-COVID, so standard working environment and employer or business premise, which made up the significant majority of workers, against non-standard working environments at the time, home working, and then workers who work in more mobile methods, either driving, traveling in their jobs, or engaging in other forms of mobile employment. And what the research showed is that flexibility can offer a range of benefits, but home working came through more strongly as an area where those benefits seem to be realised in terms of job quality indicators and in terms of well-being measures. It wasn't so evident in terms of other forms of flexibility. In particular, those who reported, flexibility in occupations that were associated with lower pay and worse conditions, and there was some analysis that looked at some of those kind of interactions. That came through as evident that job quality was lower, and the well-being impacts of those more mobile or flexible forms of employment was more negative. So that's what I've done is drawn on those 3 papers really to provide a number of bits of context. What's evident from all those papers is that flexibility can be really positive in terms of both job quality dimensions, but also in terms of well-being implications of work. What it raises as a question, coming back to the initial part of the presentation in terms of the context of the last year, is a question around whether home working is in some way an answer to the all of the labour market challenges we might have around gig working, around high levels of flexibility, around labour market inequality, and all sorts of stuff. There's a range of potential benefits that are evident in both the research I've done using Understanding Society and existing research. There's evidence that shows us both the benefits for both worker and organisation, and of course there are some wider societal benefits like reductions in commuting, for example, and the environmental impacts of that. But for the worker, increased control, autonomy and flexibility, and that's evident in particular in some of the research I've just presented from my use of Understanding Society. There's also very much a strong focus in the recent literature in the last year around the potential enhanced accessibility it provides for paid work, offering opportunities to those with care and responsibilities, disabilities, and other factors that might mean that work otherwise wouldn't be accessible. So there's a kind of inclusivity dimension potentially. And of course, the well-being benefits that are documented both in the research I've just discussed of my own, but also in existing research as well. There also is a decent amount of research and indeed from the last year, evidence in potential productivity and job performance benefits of working remotely at home. And then organizational benefits, and some of this has been discussed both in academic environments, policy environments, but also in the wider media in the last year, around reductions in accommodation costs, businesses closing workplaces, but also associated lower levels of absenteeism, lower turnover of staff, where we assume that those benefits are being felt by the workers, and improved customer services and some of those associated suggested benefits. I think what's important to note, though, I mean, and I've highlighted the title of the slide here is home working an answer. It's not the answer, because one of the most important things we have to acknowledge is that not everyone can work at home, and not everyone will want to work at home for a range of different reasons. So international estimates suggest only around 18% of workers currently could work at home. But that's, and that's heavily unevenly split internationally. So, in more advanced economies, whatever you want to call them, that might be more around 40 to 50% the potential home working in those countries. But then in lower and middle income countries, it could be as low as kind of 6 to 8% in some cases. Estimates from the ILO suggest. So there's a barrier there. There's a barrier both driven by labour market structures, technology adoption, other factors like that. There's also barriers around whether individuals would want to, and whether it would get the best out of them. Barriers historically around trust, applications of technology, health and safety, people working at home, and the potential for loss of relationships and isolation, both a kind of professional isolation from not being present within the workplace. That's perhaps a little bit less relevant if everyone's working at home and we're working remotely like we are at the minute, using video conferencing. But what about also the social aspects of work and the well-being implications of those kind of sides of work as well? So home working is potentially an answer, absolutely, but it's not the answer for everyone. I think that's an important point. And then just to finish up then, in terms of thinking a little bit more about the future of work. So emerging evidence indicates that there's a preference certainly to continue to work at home at least some of the time among some workers, and there's an increasing body of evidence that shows that there are both kind of performance benefits but also well-being benefits associated with that. But not everyone can work at home, and not everyone would benefit necessarily from this form of flexibility. And so what the evidence base really tells us, including the work I've done, is that home working should and could be adopted more broadly, but it needs to be done. So it needs to be done on a more flexible basis. We need to think about the nature of jobs, rethink strategies and job design and policies around work that provide flexibility in work that's going to benefit both workers and organizations. And in doing that, that necessarily means thinking about some of these aspects of work that we would identify as good work or job quality factors, and what influences well-being at work. I think it requires a more comprehensive kind of proactive rather than reactive approach to thinking about flexibility in work. It requires an approach that focuses on flexibility for the benefit of the employee and the employer. And we need to also, of course, think about addressing what would be lost by working flexibly in the current form, where, in many respects, we're actually not flexible at all. We have to work at home, and some of us at the minute, or we have to work wherever we're working if we're not working at home, because we can't work at home. And that isn't flexible at all. So we need to rethink what it means to be flexible, what it means to work remotely, and how those things interact. And based on the work I've done, based on the increasing body of evidence, I would argue that the greatest benefits might be obtained from a successful blending of remote and workplace-based working routines. But that requires some kind of, an organizational environment that promotes and supports that. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I shall leave it there and hand back over to Raj.